In just 5 minutes, Jasmine Crockett, a black woman, was sentenced to a $15,000 fine with not a single shred of evidence. No debate, no trial, just a pre-written verdict like a mockery of justice. But when everyone thought she'd crumble, Jasmine stood up and presented evidence that left the entire courtroom in stunned silence. What made a lone woman shake the entire system of power? Will justice truly be served? Or is it just an illusion in a society drowning in injustice? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Jasmine Crockett, a veteran civil rights attorney, had faced injustice before, but never like this. A $15,000 fine for a so-called signage violation felt absurd. Her office banner, "Justice Never Sleeps," had hung in the same spot for 3 years. No warning, no notice, just a sudden citation and a court summons. To others, it looked like red tape. To Jasmine, it smelled like retaliation. Someone wanted her quiet and fast. This wasn't about signage. It was about sending a message. The moment she stepped into courtroom 2B, the setup was clear. The lights buzzed faintly overhead. The bailiff avoided her eyes. The clerk barely looked up. But the real blow, Judge James Boasberg, already seated, already reviewing a file thick with intent. His glare wasn't neutral. It was loaded with disdain. The kind that said, "You've already lost." Jasmine's instincts screamed. This wasn't a hearing. It was a takedown. Boasberg didn't welcome her, didn't ask questions, didn't even glance at her counsel notice. He simply tapped his pen twice and said, "Let's proceed." The prosecutor looked uneasy, like he'd been dragged into something bigger than paperwork. Jasmine scanned the room. No jury, no press, no witnesses, just her, alone, targeted. The message was clear. This courtroom wasn't here to judge her. It was here to break her. Judge Boasberg didn't even look up when he spoke. His voice dropped like a blade. The court finds the defendant, Ms. Jasmine Crockett, in violation of Municipal Code 22F. A civil fine of $15,000 is hereby imposed, effective immediately. The words echoed in the room, sterile and cold, like a pre-recorded message on a machine that didn't care who listened. Jasmine blinked. Had she misheard? She glanced to her left, expecting some acknowledgement of error, some cue that the hearing hadn't actually started yet. But no one moved. No one spoke. It had begun and ended within seconds. The fine was real. The judgment was real, and her right to speak erased. She looked down at the binder in her hands, her statement, her exhibits, her precedents, printed, tabbed, highlighted, all prepared, all useless. Her legal defense had been dismantled before it was even introduced. There had been no request for clarification, no recitation of facts, no room for context, just a robotic recitation of guilt. Jasmine's lips parted to speak, but she was interrupted before she could even form the word objection. Judge Boasberg cut her off with a slight raise of his hand, a condescending gesture that signaled both dismissal and authority. His eyes finally met hers for a split second, not with curiosity, not with impartiality, but with something darker, certainty. Not legal certainty, personal certainty. He had already decided who she was, what she represented, and what he was going to do about it. There was no evidence, not a single photo presented. No citation notice entered into the record. No inspector called to testify. The supposed violation of Municipal Code 22F, allegedly related to the dimensions of her office sign, was treated as if it were gospel, without the slightest effort to prove it had occurred. Jasmine had practiced law for years. She knew what a weak case looked like. But this wasn't weak. It was empty, hollow, built on nothing but arrogance and abuse of authority. And yet no one in the courtroom flinched. The clerk continued writing as if this were standard procedure. The bailiff stood like a statue. The prosecutor, David Lindstrom, sat 2 tables over, fidgeting with his pen, visibly uncomfortable. His lips parted as if to say something, but he stopped himself. He looked from Boasberg to Jasmine and back again, then lowered his eyes to his folder. He knew this was wrong. But he also knew better than to challenge it. Not here. Not with that judge. The fine had been dropped like a bomb. Swift, unexplained, and absolute. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't the type to panic. She was the type who lit matches in rooms full of gas and knew exactly when to strike. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't flinch, slam a fist, or ask permission. Instead, she turned, calmly, deliberately, to the court stenographer. Her voice so composed it sent a chill down the spines of those listening. Please read back the judge's last statement. Precisely, every word. The courtroom shifted, not in chaos, but in stillness. Like the air had suddenly thickened. Like the building itself had realized something irreversible had been set in motion. The stenographer paused for half a second, eyes flicking nervously toward Judge Boasberg, who gave a small nod, barely concealing his irritation. Her fingers returned to the keys. The court finds the defendant in violation of Municipal Code 22F. A civil fine of $15,000 is imposed. The law is clear, and no further argument is necessary. The last sentence echoed like a slap. Jasmine absorbed it in silence, then turned back to the bench, not rushed, not hesitant, but with the poise of someone sharpening a blade behind her back. Her face betrayed nothing, but in her eyes, fire. Your Honor, she said, her tone low but cutting with precision. Just so I'm absolutely clear, are you stating on record that a citizen of this country can be penalized $15,000 without the presentation of evidence, without witnesses, without the opportunity to speak? Are you saying that the mere word of a single city employee, unaudited and unsupported, is enough to render a verdict in this court? For a long, breathless moment, the room didn't move. It was as if Jasmine's words had triggered a silent alarm, one that everyone heard but no one knew how to respond to. A man in the third row, who had been slouched with arms crossed, slowly lifted his head. Two elderly women near the back exchanged looks, whispering just barely above a breath. People who had entered the courtroom expecting another dull municipal hearing now sat up straighter, drawn into something electric. They weren't watching a proceeding anymore. They were watching a reckoning unfold in real time. The prosecutor, David Lindstrom, froze, his hand still hovering over a folder he had no intention of opening. His eyes darted to Boasberg, then to Jasmine, then back again. His posture stiffened, his jaw tightened, as if silently calculating the risk of speaking. The muscles in his neck twitched. He didn't speak. He couldn't. He was part of the machine, and the machine was jammed. Meanwhile, the court clerk, who had been diligently typing away just minutes earlier, suddenly faltered. Her fingers hovered above the keyboard, suspended mid-motion like a pianist forgetting the next note. She looked to the judge, waiting for a cue that didn't come. Even the bailiff, a man built like a wall, shifted his weight from one foot to the other. His eyes, previously glazed with routine, now tracked Jasmine closely. Tension thickened in the room like fog rolling in from nowhere. Jasmine could feel it. Not fear. Focus. Everyone was awake now. Awake to the absurdity. Awake to the imbalance. Awake to the power Jasmine had just yanked back into her hands by doing the one thing no one else dared. Ask the right question out loud. Judge James Boasberg exploded, not with a tremor but with a thunderclap. His hand came down on the bench with such force the sound echoed off the marble walls like a rifle shot. The wooden gavel stand jumped, a pen rolled to the floor, and every head in the room jerked in his direction. His face, normally stone-cold and unreadable, was now a portrait of fury. Eyebrows furrowed into a brutal arch. Jaw clenched tight. Lips curled back as if he'd been struck in the face. But he hadn't been struck. He'd been challenged. And for a man like Boasberg, that was far worse. He leaned forward, knuckles pressed white against the bench, voice shaking with rage barely kept in check. Ms. Crockett, he hissed, the name now a weapon, not a title. You will not turn this courtroom into a stage for your political theater. This is not a debate club. This is not law school. This is my courtroom, and you do not get to question the foundation of my rulings. The gallery went dead silent. Even the ventilation hum seemed to fade beneath the sheer force of his voice. His eyes burned into Jasmine, his finger rising, shaking slightly from adrenaline, and pointing directly at her like the barrel of a loaded gun. "You are out of line, entirely. If you keep this up, I will hold you in contempt. I will have you escorted from this courtroom by security. Right now, if I must." His voice was louder now, no longer measured. It cracked with emotion, with ego, with fear of losing control. "Do you understand me? This is not a place for self-righteous rhetoric. This is a court of law, and I am the law here." A court officer shifted near the wall, clearly waiting for the signal. The stenographer's hands had gone still again. The prosecutor stared at the desk like a man who didn't want to be seen. And yet Jasmine stood motionless, not blinking, not backing down. She didn't raise her voice, didn't meet his anger with her own. She simply stared at him, steady, unshaken. And that, more than anything, enraged him further. Because in that moment, everyone in the room could see the truth he couldn't hide. He wasn't in control anymore. His shouting didn't restore order. It only made the cracks in his authority more visible. And Jasmine, she knew it. She had seen this before. Not just in courtrooms, but in the eyes of powerful men when someone finally dared to speak the thing they never expected to hear. "No, you don't get to silence me." She didn't blink, didn't flinch, not even a twitch of her fingers. Jasmine Crockett stood tall, silent, steady, like marble carved by resistance itself. Her eyes didn't just meet Boasberg's fury. They studied it, absorbed it, then passed right through it, as if it were smoke and nothing more. She took one breath, controlled, deliberate, and then responded. Not with volume, not with emotion, but with the kind of clarity that makes the room lean forward. "I'm not questioning the authority of this court, Your Honor," she said, each word sliced clean and measured. "I'm questioning the legality of how that authority is being used." The room froze, not in fear, but in disbelief. It wasn't just the content of her statement, it was how she said it. No anger, no apology, no retreat. Just the weight of truth dropped like a stone into still water. Boasberg's nostrils flared, his jaw tightened again. But he said nothing, because what she said couldn't be dismissed without confirming it. She let the silence stretch, just long enough to command attention, not long enough to taunt. Then she turned to the court stenographer with fluid precision. No theatrics, no drama, just certainty. "Please ensure this entire exchange is included in the official record," she instructed, her voice firm but even. The stenographer, still stiff from the earlier outburst, nodded slowly and adjusted her keys. Her fingers returned to the keyboard with a new reverence, as if what she was now typing might one day be read in law schools. And in that moment, the temperature in the room changed, not physically, psychologically. It felt like someone had pulled the emergency brake on a speeding train. Jasmine hadn't just survived Boasberg's eruption. She had de-escalated it by refusing to play his game. And in doing so, she'd exposed a terrifying truth. The man in the robe didn't hold the room together. Fear did, and now that fear was fading. Boasberg leaned back, but the tension in his shoulders betrayed him. He wasn't relaxed. He was calculating, cornered, trying to reclaim footing he'd lost in front of everyone. If he spoke again, he risked digging the hole deeper. If he stayed silent, he looked weak. Jasmine had backed him into the one position men like him feared most: visible vulnerability. You could feel it ripple across the courtroom. The prosecutor, rigid seconds ago, was now looking at Jasmine with a flicker of something new. Not sympathy, respect. The gallery, once half asleep and indifferent, now sat upright, breaths held. The bailiff's hand drifted just slightly from his belt. Even the clerk blinked longer than normal, processing the fact that power had shifted in real time. Jasmine didn't declare victory. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply returned her gaze to the bench, calm as still water, waiting. Because she knew what everyone else was just starting to understand. This wasn't a courtroom anymore. This was a chessboard, and the judge had just lost his queen. Without breaking eye contact with Judge Boasberg, Jasmine calmly reached into her binder. Her fingers moved with precision, not haste. She wasn't scrambling. She was ready. Every step had been calculated long before she entered that courtroom. From the middle tab, marked in red, she slid out a worn legal brief its pages marked with handwritten notes and highlighter streaks that told their own quiet story. As she held it in her hands, there was no flash of drama, no grand gesture, just a quiet authority that somehow made the entire room lean forward. She held up the front page with a deliberate tilt so the seal of the court could be clearly seen. "This," she said, her voice low but unwavering, "is Sullivan v. State of Illinois." A few heads turned in the gallery. One older man in the back row shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the case by name. Decided by the Appellate Court of Illinois, 2021, a case where the court ruled, clearly and unanimously, that administrative penalties cannot be imposed without objective, corroborated evidence. The words weren't spoken like an opinion. They were delivered like a legal obituary for the judge's ruling. Jasmine stepped forward slightly, not toward the judge, but toward the space between them, that invisible line where power is usually unchallenged. She tapped her finger firmly against the document. The court found that a civil fine issued without evidentiary support, no photographic proof, no inspection report, no signed witness statement, violates due process under both state and federal constitutional grounds. She flipped to the second page, already open to the precise paragraph, as if she could do it blindfolded. Here it is. Paragraph 2. The absence of verifiable documentation renders an administrative penalty unenforceable, irrespective of the alleged authority of the issuing officer. That line didn't just strike the air. It rewired it. The courtroom, once hushed in confusion, now simmered with something new. Awareness. Awareness that Jasmine hadn't come here to argue feelings. She had come armed with facts. And not just facts. Precedent. The clerk stopped typing again, her eyes scanning the page Jasmine was referencing. The prosecutor leaned forward slightly, his brow furrowed, trying to remember if his own office had cited Sullivan in past hearings. The bailiff was motionless, hands crossed, but his eyes narrowed. He was no longer watching a defendant. He was watching a legal technician dismantle a ruling in real time. Judge Boasberg shifted in his seat, the first sign of movement from him in minutes. His elbow rose slightly. His lips parted as if to interrupt, but nothing came. Because he knew. Jasmine wasn't bluffing. She wasn't quoting hearsay or spouting theories. She had just dropped the full weight of appellate precedent onto the table like a steel gauntlet, and then she said it, quietly but loud enough for the entire room to absorb. "Your Honor, I don't need interpretation. I have precedent. Binding precedent." That single line didn't just change the conversation. It rewrote the battlefield. The courtroom was no longer a one-way stage for Boasberg to impose authority. It was now a chessboard, and Jasmine had just played a move that forced the king to pause. She didn't sit back. She didn't gloat. She let the silence stretch. Long, controlled, surgical. Because she knew, in law, it's not the shouting that wins. It's the silence that follows when the other side has nothing left to say. The courtroom held its breath, suspended between past and precedent, between rage and reckoning. Judge Boasberg sat motionless for a beat, staring at the legal documents spread across Jasmine's desk like they were physical threats. His fingers tightened against the edge of the bench. His breathing turned shallow. And then, with a sudden fury that seemed to come from deep in his chest, he erupted. "Don't you dare lecture me on the law, Miss Crockett." His voice boomed so loud it startled the court reporter, whose fingers jumped from the keys. A ripple of shock passed through the gallery. Someone audibly gasped. Another person instinctively leaned away. But Boasberg wasn't finished. He rose to his feet, not gracefully, but like a volcano rising through the floor. His robe flared at the edges as he pointed a trembling finger toward Jasmine. "I've served as a judge in this courtroom for over 2 decades. I've ruled on hundreds of cases, issued thousands of decisions. I don't need a civil rights attorney from Washington, D.C., telling me how the Constitution works inside my courtroom." His voice cracked at the end, not from weakness, but from something worse. Ego bruised by exposure. His mouth curled into a sneer. His eyes darted around the room, as if searching for backup that wasn't there. "You think just because you throw out some appellate rulings, highlight a few pages, that you can call my authority into question?" He slammed his palm against the bench again, this time harder, louder, almost desperate. "This is not a classroom. This is not a campaign. This is a court of law, and I, not you, decide what happens here. But the force behind his words rang hollow, because everyone saw it now. This wasn't control. This was panic. His tone was no longer the voice of the state. It was the voice of a man watching the scaffolding around him splinter under pressure. Jasmine didn't move. She didn't raise an eyebrow. And that only made it worse. Her stillness, her silence. It wasn't defiance. It was confidence. It was control. And it infuriated him. The prosecutor sat frozen, hands clenched in his lap, not daring to speak. The clerk no longer typed, eyes flicking between Jasmine and the judge, like a spectator at a match that had spiraled far beyond legal argument. Even the bailiff, usually a pillar of stone, shifted uneasily near the wall, his gaze fixed not on the defendant, but on the man behind the bench. Because for the first time in that courtroom, it was clear who the real defendant had become. Jasmine stood behind her defense table like a fortress. In front of her, 3 case files, Jefferson, Mendoza, and Patel, lay side by side like lined-up charges in an indictment. She didn't pace. She didn't point. She simply let the weight of precedent fill the room, her voice composed, her delivery exact. These aren't fringe decisions, Your Honor. They're binding, reviewed, upheld. In each case, courts across Illinois ruled that the opinion of a code officer, absent evidence, cannot support a fine. Not lawfully, not ethically, not ever. Her words were crisp, clinical, and devastating. Each one drove a deeper wedge between Boasberg and the legitimacy of his ruling. There was nowhere left for him to hide. She could see it in his face, the way his jaw clenched with just a hair too much tension, the way his eyes darted, not to her, but to the desk, to the walls, anywhere but the documents she had just laid bare. The courtroom had grown so quiet it was unnerving. No murmurs from the gallery, no coughs. Just the ambient hum of lights above and the faint, rhythmic tapping of the court reporter's fingers, until even that stopped. The clerk looked at Boasberg, waiting for a signal. None came, because he wasn't reacting like a judge weighing arguments. He was reacting like a man realizing the ground beneath him had vanished. Boasberg tried to speak. His mouth opened slightly, but no sentence came together. His voice, once sharp and commanding, was gone, replaced by silence and something far worse, hesitation. His hand reached for his gavel, then paused. He didn't raise it. He just touched it, like someone checking for an anchor in a storm. His eyes flicked briefly to the court clerk, then to the door behind him. And in that moment, Jasmine understood. He wasn't searching for a legal response. He was looking for an exit. Finally, he cleared his throat. The sound was hoarse, barely audible, like it had scraped through a cracked ego on its way out. Then stiffly, he muttered the words no judge says when they're in control. Court will take a 15-minute recess. No elaboration, no procedural note, not even the usual. We'll resume at... Just those 7 words. Then he stood abruptly, as if staying another second might undo him entirely. His robe swayed awkwardly as he turned and left the bench, disappearing through the chamber door with a stiffness that betrayed what he was trying to hide. But Jasmine wasn't fooled. She'd seen this before. Not in courtrooms, but in politics, in depositions, in moments where power met consequences. That wasn't a procedural pause. That was a retreat, a strategic withdrawal under the weight of undeniable truth. Boasberg needed time, not to clarify his position, but to rebuild it. Time to call someone, to skim through Sullivan, Jefferson, Mendoza, Patel, anything that could help him patch the hole in his ship before it sank completely. Around her, the courtroom remained frozen. The prosecutor rubbed his temple with slow, deliberate circles. The gallery sat stunned, as if unsure whether they had just witnessed a breakdown or a beginning. The bailiff still stood at attention, but even his breathing had changed. Shorter, sharper. Everyone in the room had felt it. The dynamic had shifted completely and irreversibly. Jasmine quietly organized the files back into her folder, her movements calm, precise. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. Because she didn't need to. The truth had already spoken for her. And when Boasberg returned, she knew one thing for certain: he wouldn't be the same man who left. When the chamber doors opened again, the room didn't just react. It tensed. Something had shifted. Boasberg re-entered first, but he wasn't alone. Behind him walked a man whose very posture broadcast rank. He wore the same black robe, but it draped heavier, darker. His steps were slower, but carried more weight. The second he entered, the temperature in the room dropped. Federal Judge Thomas Whitaker. Jasmine had never appeared before him, but she knew the name. Everyone did. His opinions were often cited in internal memos. Rigid, coldly technical, rarely reversed. A man who valued process above people. And now he was here, not summoned by law, but by strategy. Boasberg barely looked at her as he resumed his seat. "In the interest of transparency," he said, his voice steadier now, reinforced by the man beside him, "I've invited Judge Whitaker to oversee these proceedings to ensure fairness and impartiality." Whitaker didn't nod, didn't greet the room. He simply took his place beside Boasberg, hands folded, lips pressed tight, eyes already scanning the defense table as if Jasmine were a patient on an operating table. The silence that followed wasn't reverent. It was loaded. The gallery looked confused. The clerk paused mid-keystroke. The prosecutor glanced sideways like he'd just been handed reinforcements he hadn't asked for. Jasmine sat motionless. She didn't blink, didn't twitch, but she understood exactly what was happening. This wasn't about objectivity. It was about optics. Not fairness, but force. Two judges on one case for a procedural code violation? No, this was political, tactical, a message wrapped in black robes. We can outnumber you anytime we want. But something flickered behind Jasmine's eyes. Not fear, not defiance. Something quieter, sharper. The kind of clarity that only comes when you've already expected the worst. She leaned back slightly in her chair, her spine still straight, and let the corners of her mouth rise. Just a little, a half smile, a knowing one. Because power that needs backup isn't as powerful as it thinks it is. The courtroom, however, had turned against her. She could feel it in the air. Two judges now loomed before her like twin pillars of authority, silent and staring. And she, alone at the defense table, just one woman with a binder full of truth and a voice they couldn't quite silence. Yet, it was 2 against 1 now. The system versus the individual. And that's when Jasmine's focus sharpened, not in spite of the pressure, but because of it. She'd seen this tactic before, in union halls and housing rights battles, in backroom deals where a bigger chair at the table always meant someone else was being squeezed out. But unlike those moments here, she had the floor, and they still had to listen. The moment Boasberg gave the nod to resume, she didn't rush. She didn't speak immediately. She let the quiet stretch, long enough for everyone to feel the imbalance hanging in the air. Then, with a voice clear and firm, she said, "It's good to know we've drawn such high-level interest in a case involving a sidewalk sign." A few people in the gallery blinked. One chuckled, then quickly stopped. Even Whitaker's brows lifted just slightly. Jasmine looked directly at him. "I welcome any oversight that ensures due process. But if this is an attempt to outweigh my arguments with titles instead of law, I suggest we proceed, because I came prepared with both." It was subtle, it was deadly, and it was enough to recenter the battlefield, at least for now. Let them come 2 at a time. She would face them the same way she always had, alone, but unshaken. Jasmine looked squarely at Judge Whitaker, her hands resting lightly on the defense table as her voice cut through the room, measured, unwavering, sharpened by experience and something rarer: conviction. "Your Honor," she began, not with deference, but with control, "discretion has always had a place in law, but it was never meant to exist without discipline." Her words didn't rise. They dropped, low and exact, like weights falling into water. The moment we allow legal flexibility without evidentiary standard, we cross a line, from judgment to assumption, from fairness to favoritism, from law to impulse. Whitaker blinked once. A small tell, but Jasmine saw it. She continued, this time turning slightly toward the gallery, not for performance, but because the people deserved to hear what the system hoped they wouldn't understand. You call it discretion, but in this courtroom, it's become something else. A shield to justify punishment without proof. And let's be honest, this isn't the first time that shield has been used to silence someone who asked too many questions. Silence. The kind that wasn't still, it vibrated. You could feel it in the floorboards. Whitaker steepled his fingers, his face unreadable. But Jasmine didn't stop. She wasn't performing. She was prosecuting the very court that stood against her. Even a gray area has boundaries. Even discretion has a legal floor. You don't get to throw out objectivity just because you don't like who's sitting at the defense table. She paused, not to gather herself, but to let them feel the weight of what she'd just said. Discretion without standards isn't justice. It's camouflage for control. Now the audience really felt it. In the third row, a wiry man in his 60s, hands dark with grease and splinters, a carpenter who'd once fought a code violation that cost him 3 months of work, leaned forward, lips parted slightly. It clicked. He'd always suspected the process was rigged. Jasmine had just given him the words for it. Beside him, a woman in a worn military coat nodded slowly, a veteran who had once filed suit over a wrongful land seizure. She lost. She never understood why. Now she did, because Jasmine had drawn the line. This wasn't just one fine. This wasn't just one mistake. This was a ritual, disguised in procedure, cloaked in silence and dressed in robes. Boasberg sat frozen. The very courtroom that had once been his domain had turned into a stage he no longer controlled. Even the clerk's fingers hovered hesitantly above the keyboard, unsure whether she was typing court dialogue or witnessing history. Jasmine turned back to Whitaker. You speak of nuance, and I respect that, but when the facts are absent, nuance becomes noise. And when the burden of proof disappears, so does the public's trust in the law. Her voice remained even. No fury, no dramatics, just precision. Justice is built on evidence, not hierarchy. And then, softer, almost personal, she added, you can wear the robe, but if you ignore the foundation of due process, you don't represent the law. You represent power. Another beat of silence. No gavel dropped. No objection came. Because what could they say? Whitaker looked at her now, not as an interruption, but as something far more dangerous to the system, a mirror. And the people watching? They weren't just watching anymore. They were awakening. They saw it now, clearly, painfully. Not everyone in black robes speaks for justice, and not everyone who stands alone is powerless. Jasmine had just forced 2 judges into silence with nothing more than precedent and principle. Now it was time for the city's accusation to stand the same test. The man who started it all, the one who had signed the $15,000 fine, was about to face questions the system never thought anyone would dare to ask. Bailiff's voice echoed through the chamber. Nathan Ellis, please approach the witness stand. A tall, stocky man in a dark municipal uniform stood up from the gallery with an air of practiced confidence. His steps were brisk and his expression unreadable. But it was the kind of unreadable worn by people who never expect to be challenged. Ellis had testified before, dozens of times, and always unopposed. This, he thought, would be no different. He raised his hand, swore the oath, and took the witness chair like it belonged to him. Jasmine stood slowly. Her movement wasn't for theatrics. It was deliberate, controlled. A lawyer who had walked into courtrooms more hostile than this one. But this time she wasn't facing bias. She was confronting bureaucracy wearing a badge. Officer Ellis, she began, voice even, you're the individual who issued the citation under review today, correct? He nodded once. That's right. And this citation, $15,000, was issued for what you claim was a signage violation on private commercial property? Yes. The sign was too close to the curb. City ordinance requires a minimum 10-foot setback. Jasmine paced slightly, but her eyes never left him. Did you take a photograph of the violation? Ellis paused. No, ma'am, not that day. Did you return later to document it? No. Did you request a second officer or city planner to verify the violation? Number, it wasn't necessary. Did you provide the business owner, my client, with a formal written notice of inspection before issuing the fine? Ellis shifted slightly in the chair. I didn't need to. The violation was clear. I've been doing this job 22 years. I know what I'm looking at. The air in the courtroom shifted. A subtle thing. A flicker of disbelief crossing the faces of several onlookers. Jasmine leaned in, not physically but verbally. So let me summarize. You issued a $15,000 fine with no photograph, no third-party witness, no measurement report, no pre-inspection notice, and no formal documentation of the scene? Ellis looked to the bench, reflexively. Boasberg said nothing. Whitaker didn't move. I followed protocol, Ellis replied, but the confidence was starting to thin. Jasmine stepped forward slightly, just enough to claim space. What protocol would that be exactly? The one where enforcement is based on memory? On estimation? On the word of one man with a clipboard? I know a violation when I see one, Ellis snapped, then caught himself. It was obvious. Jasmine's tone dropped slightly, not in intensity, but in weight. And that, right there, is the heart of this hearing. She turned to the bench, then to the spectators. Because if we allow I just know to carry the same weight as evidence, then none of us are safe. Not homeowners, not small business owners, not even city officials. A quiet murmur ran through the back rows. The carpenter from the south side, whose garage had once been cited for a mysterious zoning violation, sat forward, eyes locked on Jasmine. A retired Army sergeant who had lost a property dispute against the city clenched her jaw. These weren't abstract arguments to them. This was their life. Jasmine pressed on. Experience is valuable. No one is questioning that. But it doesn't override the Constitution. It doesn't erase the need for proof. She turned back to Ellis. You say you knew what you saw, but how does anyone else know? Where's the proof? Where's the record that this violation existed, beyond your eyes and your word? Ellis opened his mouth, then closed it. Jasmine folded her arms. She didn't need to speak loudly. The silence around her was louder than anything she could say. Because here's the truth, plain and simple. Experience is not evidence. Authority is not accuracy. And no citizen should ever be punished based on the unchecked opinion of one official. At that moment, something happened. A subtle tilt. The energy of the room moved. Spectators leaned forward, not just with curiosity, but with recognition. The balance had shifted, not through drama, but through logic, through courage, through someone finally saying what no one else had dared to say aloud. Boasberg adjusted his robe. Whitaker narrowed his eyes but didn't speak. Ellis sat rigid, staring ahead, jaw tight. And Jasmine? She stood still, because she didn't need to move. The courtroom was already moving toward her. The court had shifted beneath her. But this wasn't just about the legalities anymore. This was about something bigger, about the freedom of individuals who were at the mercy of unchecked power. Jasmine could feel it in her bones. The moment had arrived for her to make her stand. Jasmine stood up slowly, her eyes scanning the room. The sharp tap of her heels against the polished floor was the only sound that pierced the thick silence. She didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need to shout. Her words would do that for her. If this ruling stands, she began, her voice firm, clear and piercing, then tomorrow anyone can be punished for something that doesn't exist. No proof, no evidence, just the word of one person. She paused, letting the weight of the words settle over everyone in the room. The energy was so thick, it felt like it could cut through the air. Jasmine's gaze never left the bench, where the two judges sat stiffly. But her words weren't for them. They were for everyone else, everyone who had ever felt small in the face of authority. This isn't enforcement of the law. This isn't justice. This is a man sitting in a chair with a badge, deciding for himself who's guilty. The courtroom shifted. The eyes of the spectators slowly moved toward her, drawn in by the weight of her argument. She didn't just have the law on her side anymore. She had the truth. Think about it. The small mom-and-pop store that gets fined $15,000 for a sign they never measured. The elderly man who raises his dogs in peace, only to be fined for noise complaints that aren't even real. The retired soldier who, after decades of service, puts up a fence, only to be told it's 2 inches too tall and ordered to tear it down without a single warning. Her words echoed through the room, cutting straight to the heart of the issue. The examples were real. The stories were real. These were people Jasmine had met, spoken to, and fought for. You want to know what's at stake here? It's not just to find your honors. It's the principle that no one should be punished because one man made a guess. That's not law. That's not fairness. She turned to face the gallery, and her gaze swept across the room. She could see it in their eyes. She could feel their recognition. They weren't just spectators anymore. They were witnesses to something much deeper. A business owner doesn't deserve to lose everything because one enforcement officer thought something might be wrong. An elderly man doesn't deserve to be fined because someone thought his dogs made noise. A veteran shouldn't have to tear down his property because an official had a feeling it was a violation. Jasmine didn't raise her voice, but every word struck like a hammer. She wasn't just talking about her case anymore. She was speaking for every person who'd ever been wronged by the system, every citizen who couldn't afford a lawyer to fight back. And if you think this is just about a fine, she said, now stepping closer to the bench, then you've missed the point entirely. Her voice deepened, and the courtroom seemed to lean in. Because what you're doing right now, what's happening here, is more than a miscarriage of justice. This is unchecked power. This is what happens when authority is placed in the hands of someone who has no obligation to prove their case. She didn't look away from the judges. You think this is about a minor violation, but it's not. This is about what happens when the people who enforce the law decide it doesn't need to be proved. It just needs to be accepted. The room was electric with tension. The spectators, the clerk, the bailiffs, they were all watching the system crumbling under its own weight because Jasmine had done something no one expected. She was holding it accountable. We don't convict people because we think we saw something, Jasmine continued, her voice now stronger, more resolute. We convict people because we prove something. We use facts, we use evidence, and we use the law to make sure everyone is treated equally, no matter who they are or what they look like. Her words weren't just resonating with the room. They were striking at the very core of what was wrong with this system, with the power structure that had been allowed to rule unchecked. Jasmine turned toward the back of the courtroom and nodded slightly, almost imperceptibly. A man, a veteran, shifted in his seat. He clenched his fists. His eyes were wide, understanding exactly what she meant. Next to him, an older woman in faded clothes, who'd once fought a zoning issue with the city, nodded too. They knew. They had lived it. This isn't about bending the law to suit someone's whim. This is about standing up to the system when it tries to treat citizens like suspects just because someone feels like it. Her voice was like a clarion call. It was a statement, not a plea. And if we allow this to continue, if we let this ruling stand, we're telling every citizen out there that the law is just a game where the powerful play by their own rules. And the rest of us, we're just pawns. She could feel the shift. She had them now. Jasmine stood taller, her eyes locking onto Boasberg and Whitaker. The law isn't a tool to be wielded by the powerful. It is the shield of the people. And it's time we reminded this court, and every court across this country, that the law is made for the people, not by the people in robes who think they can rewrite it at will. She let her words fall into the silence, and for the first time, there was no immediate retort from Boasberg. No objection, no defense, just silence, deep and heavy. And in that moment, Jasmine knew she had already won. The courtroom was hers. The gallery understood. The judges knew. And the truth had become undeniable. The room had reached a critical mass of tension, charged with Jasmine's argument, the judge's authority, and the anticipation of every spectator who realized something profound was about to happen. They had watched the system bend, watched a single voice confront it. Now in the aftermath of Jasmine's final stand, the question hung in the air. Would the law serve power, or would it serve justice? Judge Whitaker broke the silence first. He inhaled, a subtle motion that felt like the entire courtroom was pausing for breath alongside him. Then in a voice that seemed calmer than any he'd used before, he said, "I concur with the defendant's argument." His statement was so concise, so measured, that it struck the courtroom like a thunderclap. The city's prosecutor shifted uncomfortably, flipping through papers he no longer needed, as if hoping to find a missing piece that might change the tide. People in the gallery exchanged wide-eyed glances, uncertain they'd heard correctly. A federal judge, siding with the very woman who had confronted two robed figures, unwavering. For a moment, no one spoke. Even Boasberg remained still, his fingers tapping an unsteady rhythm against the bench. The tension wasn't gone. It had simply transformed into a stunned realization that Jasmine Crockett had, against all odds, torn through the fortress of procedural complacency. And now they waited for the final blow from the only man who still held the gavel in his hand. With the faintest tremble, Boasberg cleared his throat. His gaze flicked toward Whitaker, then back to the silent faces in the gallery. Slowly he rose, the black robe rustling like a warning. He lifted the gavel as though it weighed far more than it had an hour ago, and his voice came out cold but even. The court hereby overturns the imposed fine. That single sentence, the simplest possible phrase, carried the power of a verdict that might echo in future cases and textbooks alike. A ripple of disbelief coursed through the room, stopping short of any celebration. This was victory, but it tasted bitter in the air, an acknowledgement that the system had tried to devour someone with no proof. Jasmine's expression did not flare with triumph. She simply inclined her head as if accepting something that had always been inevitable. Though the tension in the courtroom ebbed, a heaviness remained, for everyone recognized that the outcome wouldn't erase the injustice that had led them here in the first place. People began shifting in their seats. The carpenter who'd once battled an unsubstantiated zoning ticket, the ex-soldier who had lost a property dispute under suspiciously similar circumstances, even the bailiff who had been torn between duty and empathy. They all felt it. That intangible wave of relief mingled with a somber awareness of what could have happened had Jasmine not stood her ground. Without raising her arms or cheering, Jasmine calmly collected her notes. Each paper went into her folder with methodical care, as if she were simply filing away receipts at the end of a normal workday. There was no fist pump, no theatrical outburst. She knew that this was not a moment of pure triumph. It was more of a quiet rebalancing, a near miss where justice had almost collapsed. The hush in the courtroom was thick with unspoken gratitude and silent fear, each person wondering how many times before the system had won without being challenged. And in that hush, Jasmine turned, ready to walk away from the place that had tried to bury her under the weight of unearned authority. Her footsteps against the polished tile were measured, echoing in a space that had abruptly lost its predatory edge. As she reached the oak doors, a single voice drew her back. Judge Boasberg's, unexpectedly gentle beneath the strain. "I underestimated you," he said, the words falling into the air with a weary honesty that felt foreign to everyone who had heard his earlier fury. Jasmine paused, turning just enough so that her profile faced him. The gallery watched, breath caught in collective throats, anticipating either anger or pity in her reply. But her expression remained composed, her eyes still holding the quiet flame of someone who had walked through fire without flinching. "You're not the first," she answered, every syllable steady, infused with the calm acceptance of a woman who had been dismissed one time too many. A flicker of something crossed Boasberg's face, regret, respect, or maybe both. And then she faced forward again, prepared to exit the courtroom that, ironically, now felt more like her space than it ever had for the judge who presided there. Outside, the corridor stretched long and empty, a stark contrast to the claustrophobic tension of the courtroom. Jasmine stepped into that space like someone shedding a heavy coat after a storm. She exhaled, letting the hush settle around her, feeling the reverberation of what had just taken place. For a fleeting moment, her mind flicked to the countless individuals she'd mentioned in her argument. Small business owners, retirees, unsuspecting citizens, who might never have discovered they had a right to fight back. She wondered how many times a verdict like today's hadn't been reached, simply because no one stood up, or because no one could. Yet this was not a celebration. It was a reminder, a call to remain vigilant, to keep challenging unchecked authority whenever it reared its head. As she walked toward the elevators, a few of those who had watched the entire ordeal joined the hallway, faces still flushed with the adrenaline of witnessing truth overpower a rigged process. Perhaps they'd pass the word on. Perhaps they'd share the story that justice could still be wrestled from the jaws of complacency. And Jasmine Crockett, no hero in her own eyes, continued forward, knowing the fight was never truly over. She walked out of that courthouse with neither celebration nor fanfare, just a steady stride toward the unknown. But unbeknownst to Jasmine Crockett, true aftermath of her victory would sweep across the country in ways she could never have anticipated, transforming her personal battle into a beacon of change for countless others. In the days that followed her final showdown in Cook County, the outside world began to stir with murmurs of what had happened inside that austere courtroom. A few bystanders, rattled by the sight of one woman standing her ground against two judges, told their friends, who told their neighbors, who told the local press. Then the local press picked up the story in a small column, overshadowed at first by sports headlines, but soon overshadowing everything else when readers latched onto the tale of a colossal legal system, nearly stifling a single individual with no evidence. Suddenly the story spread, jumping from blog to blog, from social media posts to radio broadcasts. Strangers started mailing Jasmine letters, envelopes arriving in battered bundles, their ink smudged but their desperation plain. One letter came from a grandmother in rural Texas, fined for excessive garden decor that supposedly violated a code no one could produce. Another arrived from a rancher in Montana, forced to pay thousands after a neighbor claimed, without proof, that his cattle were damaging property lines. And with each letter, each story, a pattern emerged, a pattern of "I said so," fines and phantom violations haunting everyday people. At first, Jasmine tried to read and respond to each message personally, devoting her evenings to carefully typed letters, offering snippets of legal advice. She'd seen injustice before, but never in such alarming volume. Each envelope she opened was another story of power unchecked. A family-run store crippled by random citations, a retired nurse fined for a fence built on her own property, a war veteran penalized for a makeshift ramp despite having no official building code to reference. The more she read, the more she realized her victory in Cook County had lit a spark in people's hearts. They finally understood that if one attorney could force a judge to admit wrongdoing, maybe the impossible wasn't so impossible after all. And that realization was like oxygen feeding an ember, turning it into a nationwide discussion about the limits of administrative authority. Before long, Jasmine found herself fielding phone calls from law schools, civic organizations, and even local government reform groups, all wanting her perspective on how one stands up to a system that often forgets its own rules. If the courthouse had felt suffocating before, now her office felt even more so, piled high with letters, articles, and invitations for interviews. But Jasmine wasn't overwhelmed. She was galvanized. She saw the desperation in these pleas and understood, with crystal clarity, that the fight was no longer just hers. Then the invitations to speak at universities began, slipping quietly into her mailbox alongside the increasingly personal letters. One such request came from the law department at the University of Texas. A handwritten note from a professor who'd watched footage of the Cook County trial, footage leaked by a court observer's phone, and recognized in Jasmine's calm, incisive manner the perfect model for teaching students about constitutional rights versus bureaucratic overreach. The professor wrote passionately, describing how they wanted to incorporate her case into a new civics and civil rights curriculum, how it offered a ground-level example of how easily authority could slide into misuse when nobody demanded proof. Intrigued, Jasmine accepted, flying down to Texas for what she assumed would be a modest lecture to a handful of curious students. Instead, she arrived to find an overflowing auditorium, professors crammed in the back, students lining the halls, some even sitting on the floor. Many of them carried printouts of the Cook County transcripts, highlighting her cross-examination of the enforcement officer. Others clutched scribbled notes, questions about due process, about evidence, about the constitutional guardrails that are supposed to protect citizens but can fail without vigilance. Standing at the lectern, Jasmine realized that this was the real victory, far more meaningful than any courtroom acquittal, planting the seed of skepticism, of rightful questioning, in the minds of the next generation of legal minds. Her lecture at the University of Texas sparked a campus-wide conversation. Should administrative rulings be subject to tighter evidentiary standards? Were municipal officers being trained or just handed unchecked power? Word of the debate spread to neighboring campuses, and soon Jasmine found herself bouncing between invitations to speak at panels, roundtables, and university conferences. She became a reluctant figurehead of a grassroots wave demanding actual proof for all code-related fines. The press, sensing a larger story, picked up on this surge of curiosity and followed Jasmine's trail. Local TV stations ran segments titled Evidence or Assumption, The Fight for Fair Process, and When the Law Forgets Itself. Podcasts dedicated hours of airtime to dissecting her legal strategy. Her ability to remain calm under withering pressure, her unwavering insistence that evidence is the bedrock of justice, but her days were not spent basking in fame. She was too busy sifting through the tidal wave of new cases, answering calls from retired mechanics, single mothers, and community organizers who saw in her a champion for their own unwinnable fights. At night, she'd collapse into bed, mind still racing, swirling with the stories of real people whose lives had been twisted by arbitrary rulings. And every morning she rose again with a renewed sense of purpose, knowing that Cook County was not an anomaly. It was the tip of a far-reaching iceberg of administrative injustice. The climax came one afternoon when Jasmine was halfway through a stack of letters, each detailing a fresh instance of code enforcement gone wild. Her phone buzzed with an unknown number from Washington, D.C. Expecting another local journalist or maybe a nonprofit organization, she picked up, only to hear the voice of a congressman who introduced himself politely, then dove straight into business. "I've read the transcripts from your Cook County case, Ms. Crockett," he said, voice crackling with urgency. "We've been monitoring a trend of unconstitutional administrative fines for a while now, but your case puts a spotlight on how out of control it's gotten." He explained that he was spearheading a legislative effort to mandate strict evidentiary requirements for any administrative penalty. Any municipal or state-level fine would need tangible proof, photographic or otherwise, to be enforceable. "We'd like your expertise," he said simply, "in crafting language that ensures no citizen is penalized on the basis of, 'I said so.'" Her heart pounded. She hadn't set out to change the law itself. She had only wanted to defend one case of injustice. Yet here she was, standing on the precipice of systemic reform. That phone call led to a series of meetings in Washington, closed-door discussions in dimly lit committee rooms where gray-suited staffers took furious notes, and Jasmine's calm, precise voice explained the blow-by-blow of how a person could be fined thousands without a shred of proof. She detailed the real impact these fines had on ordinary people, many of whom never contested them because they lacked the time, money, or confidence to stand up against City Hall. She recounted the transcripts from her own hearing, describing each moment in which the burden of evidence was replaced by the arrogance of authority. For some staffers, it sounded like fiction. Could it really be that easy for officials to penalize individuals with no documentation? Jasmine's answer was unflinching. Yes, it could. Yes, it was happening right now. And if they didn't codify stricter guidelines, the problem would grow beyond the boundaries of any single county or city. More than once, she had to pause to let them process the scale of it. The thousands of letters, the phone calls, the horror stories from every corner of America. Each meeting ended with nods of grim acknowledgement and renewed promises to fight for a law that would force accountability onto local governments. She left the Capitol each time, exhausted yet oddly hopeful, because her personal battle was now something bigger than a single court case. As the proposed bill began to take shape, Jasmine's inbox exploded again, this time with messages of excitement, cautious optimism, and even stark skepticism from those who had been burned too many times to believe in legislative remedies. Some people thanked her for making a difference. Others worried the bill would be watered down by political wrangling. Across the media, headlines started proclaiming new legislation could mandate objective evidence for code violations, and Congress targets municipal overreach. Talk shows invited her for interviews, asking how a single court battle in Cook County had mushroomed into a nationwide movement. She always gave the same measured reply, that it wasn't her alone, but the collective voices of everyday people who had felt the injustice pressing down on them. The public latched on to her sincerity. She had never claimed to be a hero. She claimed to be a lawyer doing what lawyers were supposed to do: defend those who can't defend themselves by shining a light on where the law had been ignored. And in those TV segments, her demeanor never changed, still calm, still unwavering, because the scope of this problem was too massive for triumphal fanfare. Instead, she persisted in telling real stories, names, faces, places, making it harder for politicians to turn a blind eye. Every time a new broadcast aired, more letters flooded in, each voice an echo of the same plea: don't let them forget us. Meanwhile, at the University of Texas and other campuses nationwide, law professors seized upon Jasmine's Cook County victory like it was a case study in how the judiciary could fail if citizens refused to question it. Students dissected transcripts, analyzing how she maintained composure under Boasberg's fury, how she dismantled flimsy evidence, how she used reason rather than outrage to expose a foundational crack in administrative law. Classroom debates raged about whether or not the system could truly reform itself, or if it would always need outside challengers like Jasmine to keep it honest. Some students even formed legal aid societies, offering free advice to local residents battling code violations. Professors reported a surge in interest in public service law, with students citing her hearing as the spark that lit a fire in them. Soon, the name Crockett was spoken in corridors alongside names like Brandeis and Marshall, not for the scale of her achievements, but for the principle she championed: that no judge, no code enforcer, no official had the right to penalize a person without proof. Back in Chicago, Jasmine heard rumors of these movements, occasionally receiving an email from a bright-eyed law student explaining how her ordeal had inspired them to pursue constitutional litigation. Every email stoked her quiet resolve, reminding her that the seeds she'd planted were blossoming in places she might never see firsthand. Finally, the day arrived when the new bill, colloquially dubbed the Show Me the Evidence Act, was introduced on the congressional floor. Crafted with Jasmine's input, the legislation aimed to create a federal baseline for due process in administrative penalties. Representatives stood to speak about the rampant issues they discovered in their own districts. Overdue library fines turned into municipal liens, unverified building code citations crippling local businesses, entire communities afraid to speak up because they assumed the government must be right. Over the course of a heated debate, lines were drawn between those who believed in tighter checks and those who argued that local officials should maintain broad discretion. Yet each time someone claimed the law would hinder municipal enforcement, Jasmine's supporters rose to counter with her testimony, reminding everyone that common sense must always be underpinned by common proof. After hours of back and forth, a vote was called. The margin was close, but the bill passed its first major hurdle. The House of Representatives approved it, sending it onward toward further legislative checkpoints. Outside, reporters swarmed the congressman who'd spearheaded the effort, peppering him with questions about whether Jasmine's case had truly been the tipping point. He answered with a short statement. She reminded us that unchecked authority is tyranny by another name. The cameras whirred, the crowd buzzed, but in a quieter sense, an entire country exhaled, seeing a glimmer of hope that the law could still bend toward justice. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.